Hi there and welcome to the channel of A Disappointed Man with me, Jason Kennedy, the Disappointed Man, and I'm coming to you today from a very rainy Taiwan, so apologies for the s on this video. I'm going to be talking about Christopher Isherwood's extremely short 1946 novel Prater Violet, but before we come on to that, let's talk a little about the author himself. Isherwood was born in 1904 at Wybersley Hall on his family's country estate in Cheshire in the northwest of England. He belonged to what I suppose we'd call the English upper middle classes, and in traditional fashion he was packed off to prep school as a young boy, where he first met W.H. Auden, who would become his lifelong friend, sometime lover and frequent collaborator. The two parted as boys but reunited at Cambridge, where they formed a part of what became known as the Auden generation, along with figures such as Cecil Day-Lewis and Stephen Spender. Isherwood nursed literary ambitions from an early age, even going so far as to deliberately flunk his Tripos at Cambridge, thereby putting paid to any possibility of a career as an academic. He published his first novel while he was in his early 20s, All the Conspirators, and his second he wrote while he was in Berlin, The Memorial, which was published in 1932. Now, living in Berlin, Isherwood was one of the few British writers to observe firsthand the rise of the Nazi Party, and he charted both his own personal development and the social and political change around him in his Berlin Stories, which, when they were collected together in 1939 as Goodbye to Berlin, made him extremely famous. They contain his most celebrated sentence, "I'm a camera," his most popular character, Sally Bowles, and were the basis for a play, a musical, and the extremely successful Hollywood movie Cabaret. Now, in 1939, the same year Goodbye to Berlin was published, Isherwood and Auden decided to leave Europe behind and take a cruise ship together to America, where they would begin new lives. Auden on the East Coast, and Isherwood, after some moving around, opting to settle in California, where he would reside for the remainder of his life. Now, as mentioned, both Isherwood and Auden were homosexual, and this fact was not addressed directly in Isherwood's early work. However, in the more permissive surroundings of California, he began to openly address his sexuality in such novels as 1964's A Single Man. This novel, which focuses on a single day in the life of George, a middle-aged Englishman who's a professor at a university in California, uses the stream of consciousness technique, which was so frequently employed by Isherwood's favourite writer, Virginia Woolf. Isherwood was a highly productive writer throughout his life, and because all of his writings were highly autobiographical, it's possible to trace his development both as a person and as a writer from his boyhood all the way through to his final years in his 80s. And besides writing approaching 20 novels, he also published thousands of pages of his diaries and even his letters to his mother. With such a mountain of material confronting the first-time reader of Isherwood, the obvious question is where to begin. Now, some people think, oh, I know, I'll begin at the start of his career and read through chronologically. I think that's a mistake with Isherwood, because his early work was actually rather weak. I think that the book I'm going to talk about, Prater Violet, is a better starting point for two reasons. Firstly, it was written some 20 years into his career, where he's already a very accomplished writer, and secondly, it's rather short. You can read it in just a couple of hours. So, all that being said, let's turn our attention now to the work in question. Prater Violet fictionalizes real events, namely Isherwood's period of employment as a screenwriter on the movie Little Friend, renamed Prater Violet for the novel, hence the title. This movie was directed by Berthold Viertel, who in Prater Violet is known as Friedrich Bergman. The novel opens toward the end of 1933, which is important for two reasons that I'll come on to, with Isherwood back home in London at the family home, when one day there is an unexpected call from a movie studio asking him to come to a meeting. Isherwood plays it very cool and hangs up, returns to the dining table and tells his mother and brother who it was. They are absolutely thrilled and they're convinced that the phone will ring again. It does, with again a request to come to a meeting, but not just in a day or two, but right away at a hotel in London. Isherwood now swallows his pride, says, "I'll be there," and scrambles across to the other side of London to meet Bergman for the first time, and it's here that the fun begins. The Bergman of Prater Violet is, by all accounts, a fiendishly accurate portrayal of Berthold Viertel, a deeply intellectual, hugely temperamental, extremely eccentric Austrian Jew, and I think the best way to give you a flavour of his character is if I read a couple of passages. This is from the second occasion when Bergman and Isherwood meet, and he takes him back to his bedsit in Kensington for the first time. Raising his forefinger smilingly to indicate that I must be patient, he began to rummage among the clothes and scattered papers. I watched with growing curiosity as Bergman's search became increasingly furious. Now and then he would discover some object, evidently not the right one, hold it up before him for a moment like a nasty-smelling dead rat, and toss it aside again with a snort of disgust, or some exclamation such as "abominable," "scheußlich," "too silly for words." I watched him unearth in this way a fat black notebook, a shaving mirror, a bottle of hair tonic, and an abdominal belt. Finally, under a pile of shirts, he found a copy of Mein Kampf, which he kissed, before throwing it into the waste paper basket. "I love him," he told me, making a wry, comical face. The search spread into the bedroom. I could hear him plunging about, snorting and breathing hard, as I stood by the mantelpiece, looking at the photographs of a large blonde humorous woman and a thin, dark, rather frightened girl. Next, the bathroom was explored. A couple of wet towels were flung out into the passage. Then Bergman uttered a triumphant "Aha!" He strode back into the living room, waving a book above his head. It was my novel, The Memorial. Not only is that passage richly comic, but through the photos on the mantelpiece, it also introduces Bergman's family, who he has left behind in Austria. And this is one of the reasons why the fact the novel takes place in late 1933, early 1934 is significant, because this was a time of growing unrest in both Germany and Austria. In fact, the Austrian Civil War would break out in 1934, and throughout Prater Violet, Bergman is fretting over the safety of his family. The second reason the time in which the novel is set is significant is, if you recall, I said Prater Violet was published in 1946, but it's looking back at events that took place in 1933. What this means is Isherwood, the writer, is able to poke fun at the man he was 13 years before, and that is one of the features of this work. And I'll just read you a very amusing passage where Isherwood is contemplating what a crap writer he is, having previously believed himself to be rather good. Bergman has told Isherwood to write dialogue to accompany scenes of the ordinary people of Vienna enjoying themselves at the Prater in the years before World War I, and Isherwood's realizing, I couldn't. My impotence nearly reduced me to tears. It was all so simple, surely. There is Tony's father, for instance. He is fat and jolly, and he has a store where he sells Wiener Würstchen. He talks to his customers. He talks to Tony. Tony talks to the customers. They reply. It is all very gay, amusing, delightful. But what the hell do they actually say? I didn't know. I couldn't write it. That was the brutal truth. I couldn't draw a table. I tried to take refuge in my pride. After all, this was movie work, hack work. It was something essentially false, cheap, vulgar. It was beneath me. I ought never to have become involved in it, under the influence of Bergman's dangerous charm, and for the sake of the almost incredible £20 a week which Imperial Bulldog was prepared, quite as a matter of course, to pay me. I was betraying my art. No wonder it was so difficult. Nonsense. I didn't really believe that either. It isn't vulgar to be able to make people talk. An old man selling sausages isn't vulgar, except in the original meaning of the word belonging to the common people. Shakespeare would have known how he spoke. Tolstoy would have known. I didn't know because, for all my parlour socialism, I was a snob. I didn't know how anybody spoke except public school boys and neurotic bohemians. A brutally frank yet rather humorous piece of self-assessment there. Now, the first half of the novel focuses on the 3-month period in which Isherwood and Bergman convene daily at the latter's apartment to work intensively on the screenplay for Prater Violet. Inevitably, all this close contact sees their relationship develop, and what I really enjoyed is the way Isherwood captures the multifaceted nature of this nascent friendship. There's the father-son aspect, there's the teacher-pupil aspect, but there's also what Isherwood does for Bergman. As a fluent German speaker and with first-hand experience of the rise of fascism in Germany, he can communicate with Bergman in his native tongue and understand his deep concern for what the future holds for the Jews of Austria. And he also, importantly, becomes an ally. And this will become crucial in the second half of the novel when shooting begins on the movie itself. Bergman remains centre stage during this section, and we watch him struggling on 3 fronts, with the studio executives who at various points threaten to pull the plug on the entire project, with the crew and the cast, which includes the typical diva of a leading lady, and finally to impose his artistic vision on the material itself. Isherwood, meanwhile, has taken on 2 further roles on set, that of minder and, equally importantly, of political advisor, trying to rein in the combustible Bergman, who's always threatening to explode. Now, earlier I said I would read a second passage showing off the eccentricity of Bergman. I've decided against it. It would be something of a spoiler, but let me just say this. Bergman's sightseeing tour of London is a sequence not to be missed, and it's Bergman himself, rather, who becomes the sight that everyone is interested in seeing. It's just wonderful. As you may have gathered by now, I greatly enjoyed Prater Violet. The writing is so crisp, it feels like it could have been written yesterday. But what lifts it to a whole new level is the coda Isherwood supplies, which is artistically very courageous. It's extremely lyrical, and we have this change, complete change in tone, which underscores the deeper themes which have been at work in what is outwardly a rather comic piece. Before I go, I want to have an aside now about the rather strange affinity between Isherwood and Prater Violet and a writer and book I've already reviewed on this channel, Marguerite Duras and her wonderful novel, The Lover. Isherwood and Duras both lost their father at an early age. Both of them wanted to be writers from an equally early age. And in Prater Violet and The Lover, what we're really witnessing is the search for a father figure. Very interesting that both of them also had close connections with the movie industry. Isherwood wrote several screenplays, while Duras actually won an Oscar for her screenplay for Hiroshima Mon Amour. I'm suggesting here that those who enjoyed Marguerite Duras' novel, The Lover, are likely to enjoy this offering from Isherwood and vice versa. So there you have it. I'm done. The only thing that remains is for me to bid you farewell. So until the next time, be safe, be strong, nanu nanu.